Well, hello there. I'm back again. I know I took a little week off from reading my grandfather's stories, but I am back. I had a little rough patch of of handling the staying at home and not going anywhere and not doing anything, and it kind of then I had a work backlog, and I still have a work backlog, but this is important, and I am very excited to be back to read more from my grandfather's book, Nowhere Except San Francisco, Memoirs of a Resident Tourist by Tro Harper. And so if you're watching today, I hope that you enjoy where we are. Our last chapter was about Mrs. Phipps and the other old ladies of San Francisco who help keep things like the orchestra and the ballet funded. In this day and age, we need those little old ladies to continue funding the zoo, the museums, all the places that are closed temporarily, hopefully. But we really don't know for how long. Possibly through the summer, which is a very big time for a lot of these institutions because of tourism and travel. But enough about here and now. Let's talk about there and then. Fisherman's Wharf. This is what we're talking about now. Have you been to Fisherman's Wharf? Have you been to San Francisco and visited Fisherman's Wharf? Let's hear what my grandfather had to say. If tourists want to get the feel and odors of an Italian seaside village, all they have to do is get on a cable car, ride through the area known as Little Italy, along Columbus Avenue to jog down Taylor Street to the end of the line, get off, and walk 2 blocks to Fisherman's Wharf. Even on the Hyde Street line, you will wind up in the vicinity of the wharf, as walking a couple of blocks along a waterfront lined with historic ships in the Maritime Museum will deliver you to that piscatorial Mecca. At Pier 45 lies a World War II submarine. Like strolling through Chinatown with its sense of oriental adventure about to happen, edging your way through the boiling crab pots, the souvenir hawkers, the restaurant Pullers Inn at Fisherman's Wharf reminds many misty morning visitors of Harbor's Edge along the Bay of Naples. Names like DiMaggio, Scoma's, Cafe Pescatore, Cafe Reggio, Dante's, Pompei's Grotto, and Tarantino's, which, by the way, was started by a couple of entrepreneurs with Irish names, set the tone for the visitor in search of the real San Francisco. It used to be that the crowded moorings at Fish Alley were choked with high-sterned Chinese junks, plus row upon row of blue and white boats powered by large triangular lateen sails reminiscent of the Gulf of Genoa and the north coast of Africa. Today, most of the boats are powered by internal combustion engines, usually one-lunger Hicks engines with their chug-chug-chug pop sound. Today, the boats, for the most part, are still blue and white, painted in the tradition of Sicilian fishermen for centuries. The 70-foot trawlers, manned by newly arrived Vietnamese, bark with the roar of giant diesels as they maneuver for space along the crowded piers. Today, Fisherman's Wharf is home to a new generation of Chinese, Thais, Filipinos, French, Chinese, Norwegians, Slavonians, Mexicans, and Japanese, making it probably the most representative mixture of melting pot America. Change is rapid here at Bayside, more so than in any other area of the city. After all, most of the world lives by fishing, so it is no surprise that immigrants find work as fishermen. In times past, housewives used to have their carriages driven to the wharf to pick up seafood. Today, cracked crab, steamed clams, sole, shrimp, salmon, sea bass, and squid can be bought on the street, along with loaves of sourdough bread wrapped in envelopes bearing the name of Italian and French bakers, which are sold to motorists at curbside, sort of a piscatorial drive-in. You will, however, still see old-timers of the crab fleet mending their nets by hand with big needles of wood, plus the huge flocks of seagulls intent on scavenging whatever scraps are dumped into garbage bins by the various seafood processors in the back alleys. Also, barking seals still cruise the piers hoping for a handout of whatever they can beg, and small boys still cluster at the ends of piers hoping their hooks will soon impale a fish for mom. If you happen along too early in the day, you might not find a crowd of boats on hand, as the fishing fleet usually leaves the wharf with the tide, between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, bound for the fisheries at 5 or 6 miles outside the Golden Gate. In the mid-afternoon, the fishermen begin to line up once more to unload their catches, mend their nets, and wash down the decks for the morrow's work. Way back when I was a radio reporter, our station did a story on the fishing fleet. From my youth, I was taught that seagulls were sacred, not to be either touched or killed, so it was a tremendous surprise to me to see a fisherman grab a hunk of timber and, as a seagull hovered over a dropped fish head in the stern of the boat, slam the seagull out of the air and immediately begin plucking feathers from the wings to form a lure for catching salmon. There is little sport about deep-sea fishing for money. Another surprise was to see rock cod dragged from the bottom of the sea with their eyes bugged out as the pressure lessened toward the surface. These unfortunates also got a whack. The backup stores for the fishing industry line the outer reaches of the wharf, where blacksmiths, boat builders, tackle menders, net repairers, marine hardware dealers, plus a marine service station for fuel line the streets. But the feature that enthralls the tourists and never fails to attract a crowd is watching the vendors toss live crabs into iron cauldrons boiling over open fires. Children scream, women shiver, and men remain impassive. This is not a sight you will see in Cleveland. Meantime, other tourists savor the results of this labor as they spoon mouthfuls of crab bits from polystyrene cups while strolling through the clumps of people. Almost everyone who visits Fisherman's Wharf finds some feature to tell the folks back home about, and no wonder. It is the second most popular tourist attraction on the Pacific coast, slightly behind Disneyland, somewhere down among the waving palms of Orange County. Come to think of it, Disneyland with crab cocktails might just edge out New York City. On to another chapter. Oh, I was going to check my Twitter account and make sure people, are you here? Are you watching? Let me know in the comments. Let me know if you're reading along with me, listening. I'd love to see your notes when I'm not reading, I guess. We're on to another little chapter. This is called Frisky Whiskey. Frisky Whiskey? After the earthquake and fire of 1906, moralists pounded their pulpits and said that God had punished the city for its lax ways and tolerance of licentiousness and depravity. But there was an anomaly, a fly in the ointment, as it were. Down in the devastated business district, Hotteling's Warehouse, a local liquor depository that brimmed with alcoholic spirits, stood straight and sound, untouched by divine intervention. Charlie Field, famous for his ballads and jingles, wrote, "If, as they say, God spanked the town for being over frisky, why did he burn all the churches down and spare Hotteling's whiskey?" Oh, San Francisco. San Francisco. Oh, who do we have there? Kurt Larson. Hi there. I didn't move my monitor, so it's like a little way around there. Now, let's move on to a few pages on Powell Street. Powell Street, an informal guide. Powell Street's where my grandfather had his bookstore. He may mention that here, but let's learn. San Francisco's Powell Street is not exactly a main artery, a thoroughfare, or an avenue. Certainly not a boulevard, but it is one of the best-known streets in the world. If Post Street is the Alice in Wonderland of streets, then Powell Street is surely the Mad Hatter. Raffish and undisciplined, Powell Street neither knows or cares what is going on elsewhere, and that goes for the whole world. The lore of Powell Street is known to almost all tourists. It's right downtown where the large majority of tourists congregate to watch or ride cable cars. In San Francisco, Powell Street is where the action is. Almost any kind of action you want. From 10 in the morning until well past midnight, the sidewalks are filled with gawkers, stragglers, dreamers, would-bes, wannabes, and has-beens. Dapper Dans, Fancy Dans, the lame, halt, and the blind, plus lots of women who look like men, and a number of men who not only look like women but walk and talk like them too. Towards Market Street, the sidewalks are so crowded it's hard to saunter without being trampled, slowed, or forced into the street, there to dodge the oncoming cable cars. Oddly, a lot of San Franciscans avoid Powell Street, viewing the whole scene as part of a demi-monde, a loutish sideshow. This is probably an accurate appraisal, since when you look at the pedestrians separately as individuals, you reach around to button your wallet pocket, or if you are a woman, clutch your purse a trifle more tightly, or take an extra turn around your wrist with the camera strap. In the coffee shops that dot the street, you can see the purposeless who sit for hours staring through the windows at the passers-by while aimlessly stirring their cold coffee, a San Franciscan version of a sidewalk cafe. In the lobbies of the hotels that line Powell between Market and Geary, they sleep over their morning chronicles, hoping someone won't trip over their outstretched legs. Others stand on the street corners, rocking on their heels while explaining to the flower sellers or the news vendors the solutions they have to whatever crisis currently faces the country. As George Burns, the ageless comic who died recently, said, "Why is it all the people who know how to fix the government and its problems are either busy cutting hair or driving taxis?" He might have added, or walking on Powell Street. The bookstores and magazine stands along Powell Street are eternally filled with browsers who rarely buy but can spend hours looking at pictures rather than go home to a single room where the only thing to relieve the monotony is the faded wallpaper, or out the window at the brick wall of the adjacent building. Over time, I have learned to recognize the Powell Street cowboys, since you can tell them from the tourists in a flash. For one thing, they don't wear white shoes, forbidden dress in San Francisco. Nor will they be flaunting sports shirts, shorts, or flimsy trousers. Through long experience, the natives know what the weather around 4 o'clock in the afternoon will be: cold, windy, raw, even in August, or more accurately, especially in August, when the fog rolls in and the wind updrafts through Powell Street, thrashing the trees and the big containers that line the sidewalks and flogging the candy wrappers into sudden storms. Tourists carry batteries of cameras around their necks, the better to record scenes that have been photographed thousands of times. When I think of all the drugstore negatives and prints stuffed in the drawers of their desks, bureaus, and closets, I envy George Eastman and his profits from the invention of roll film. A man named O'Reilly used to hang out at the corner of Powell and O'Farrell. From morning to night, he would stand on the street corner outside the Marquardt cigar and magazine store, together with 2 of his cronies. These 3 would, by turns, discuss politics, horse racing in general, the economy, dog racing, their friends, the gambling joints in Reno, and what horse looked good in the 7th at Tanforan that afternoon. Once in a while, when they went to the track, they would tell each other about a big win they made yesterday at Golden Gate Fields. The corner bookie joint around the corner and upstairs over the cigar stand was their home away from home. These men weren't invented by Damon Runyon, but they could have been. As you might have gathered by now, O'Reilly and his pals were horse players. They made no bones about declaring themselves as gamblers. Gambling was their stated livelihood, their passion. They were happy in their work, and, of course, gambling on the horses was the main frame of their morning conversations. They thought and talked of little else. They practiced their trade wherever and whenever the opportunity presented itself. I never really got to know the complete names of these three and knew them only as O'Reilly, Higgins, and Duntov. O'Reilly was a horse-faced man of medium to tall height, always dressed in the manner of a Montgomery Street stockbroker. Brown fedora, snap-brim hat, a dark gray single-breasted top coat, clean white shirt and necktie, plus a collar pin that gathered his shirt collar loosely around the knot in his tie. He had closely set eyes, drooping jowls, and a tight mouth, which made his thin lips seem even thinner. Always, he assumed a supercilious expression. While talking with him one day, it occurred to me that his thin lips had grown that way from his habit of speaking out the corner of his mouth, scarcely moving anything else. If you didn't listen carefully, it was impossible to understand a word he said. He may have developed his manner of speech from long years of trying to prevent anyone who might be standing near or could read lips from discovering what was the best bet in the next race. His skin wore a midnight gambler's pallor, nowadays known as a neon tan. O'Reilly prided himself on his neat appearance and was constantly dusting his outer clothing, brushing away flicks of this or scraps of that, until I began to feel pretty crawly myself. At times I felt like saying, "Please don't brush those things on me," but I never did. Once he told me he was born and raised in Natick, Massachusetts, leaving there only because he married a woman from San Francisco. Back east, he had been a sometime ice skating instructor when he could fit it in between his trips to nearby horse or dog tracks of the area. Once he got to San Francisco, he never even thought about moving anywhere. As the story unfolded, I realized why he did not go back. Not only why he did not go back, but couldn't go back. His wife was the mainstay for his daily bread. That she had a good job downtown on Montgomery Street was all he ever told me about her. The closest O'Reilly ever came to being employed was during World War II, when he got the idea he could spend nights along Market Street, selling rubber stamps and stamp pads to soldiers and sailors for marking clothing articles. During World War II, the nighttime streets fairly swarmed with servicemen. Where a storekeeper closed for the day, O'Reilly would set up his card table in the entryway, spread out stamp pads, stamps that could be changed to whatever name was needed, plus tapes on which to stamp, a package deal costing the buyer a total of $3.75. In 4 years of the war, O'Reilly managed to sock away $17,500, or thereabouts, and still contribute to the upkeep of his family. The IRS was not the formidable edifice that it is today, and besides, the transactions were all in cash. Very hard to trace. Then one day, a hunch he felt to the soles of his shoes possessed him, and he journeyed to Tanforan Racetrack and lost the entire bundle in one afternoon. I suppose it is almost indecent to suggest his wife was angry, but somehow the marriage survived this debacle. O'Reilly used to spend a great deal of time in my bookstore, which was on the opposite side of the street. The late afternoon cold made my intellectual emporium an attractive haven from the blasts swirling down O'Farrell Street. Although his favorite books were those on horse racing and gambling, he rarely read anything for more than a few seconds and never bought. Ideas on gambling from a source other than his own intuition seemed to bore him, and as a result, it wasn't long after he returned the first book to the shelf than he picked yet another. Eventually, he would open the conversation with an explanation of how he had bet on a horse this afternoon at Santa Anita, but somehow it had not run as fast as all the other horses. Occasionally, I used to twit him with Damon Runyon's line, "All horse players die broke." But he would respond, "Don't you believe it? Higgins hit it big today." I never had the courage to ask him how many days in the past Higgins had lost not only his own shirt, but his confidence as well. Higgins was O'Reilly's sidekick. He was a big, fat man with tremendous bulging jowls, which were made to look even more inflated than they were by his heavy, horn-rimmed glasses. Higgins was an immaculate dresser. His hat was a gray snap-brim fedora, his topcoat double-breasted. To my knowledge, Higgins had no other means of support than his investments. as he called his gambling ventures. No matter how low his credit might be, he looked prosperous, and his fat face was spread in a perpetual smile. I often thought his motto must be, "When the credit is low, order champagne." I think I'm going to take that. I like that. His speech, at least when he talked with me, was as florid as his complexion. "And how is the purveyor of romantic nonsense, lost causes, and the world's wisdom this afternoon?" He got a kick out of the sign on the front of the bookstore, which read in large capital letters, "Books." "That space would make a hell of a space for a bookmaking operation, a bookmaker in the back of a bookstore." He would laugh and pat his stomach in anticipation of such a delicious idea. He never failed to relish his joke. The third member of the trio, Duntov, was a tall, cadaverous man, well over 6 feet in height, with a long, sorrowful face that always reminded me of a sad bloodhound, or a horse that was trying to peer through a fence. His clothing, in contrast to his natty friends, was disheveled, you might say disreputable. He spent much of his time complaining about the price of coffee in the various spas along Powell Street, and was outraged one day when he discovered the new Walgreen drugstore, which was about to open, was going to charge only 7 cents a cup, since he had been paying 10 cents up the street. His erstwhile suppliers had suddenly become robbers, profiting from the gullibility of their customers. For almost a week, he bemoaned the fact that Walgreens wasn't yet open, and that the other store still insisted on a dime a cup. But he was left in a dilemma, since if he didn't go there, where would he spend at least 2 hours of the day? It was my opinion the restaurants in the area should not only have charged him for the coffee, but also rent for the stools he occupied. Higgins once told me that Duntov was heir to a fortune his father had made in some trading stamp company, although I never felt I could ask him about it, since one thing you learn along Powell Street is that inquiring into other people's business will get you a reputation for asking stupid questions. One thing I know for sure, however, is that Duntov had plenty of money on him at all times. When he pulled out his roll to buy something, all you saw were 10s and 20s, although I couldn't guarantee the roll was not partly made of newsprint. Whenever I saw him in his automobile, I used to wonder how a man who drove a brand new Cadillac could occupy himself so diligently with the price of magazines, 10-cent coffee, and cigarettes. Were he alive today, he no doubt would have fallen in a dead faint when the clerk told him the price of a cup of coffee was now $1. Once I was passing the time with O'Reilly for an hour or so, listening to his life as an ice skating instructor when he lived in Natick, Massachusetts, and I mentioned I hadn't seen Higgins for a couple of months. O'Reilly looked at me, surprised, and then from the corner of his mouth, "Hadn't you heard? Higgins is in real estate." It was a couple of minutes before a shiver went up my back, as I realized Higgins had died. He actually was in real estate, about 6 feet of it. When I walk down Powell Street today, I think of O'Reilly, and I miss him. Although his world and mine were so different, I was always fascinated by his descriptions of his lifestyle, as they say nowadays. The last I heard, he was selling pari-mutuel tickets at various racetracks up and down the coast. Whatever happened to Duntov, I don't know, and of course, Higgins is in real estate. Every so often, just before dropping off to sleep, I think of the swear lady, with a voice so strident and grating she could easily drown the clanging cable car bells, the roar of diesel buses, or the din of metal on metal as the cable cars bumped along the rickety tracks. She was a little bit of a thing, weighing not more than 95 pounds, but she had lungs in equal in capacity to a Goodyear blimp. Her wispy grayish hair, which hadn't been combed in 20 years, could have been any color when she was young. Her eyes were dull gray, without a semblance of life behind them, ever ready to deliver another stream of blasphemies Her mouth was always wide open. Attired in a formless, dirty dress that would have sat on a rummage sale shelf forever, shod with tennis shoes and rumpled stockings, she was disheveled enough to frighten children. Her dirty coat displayed the residue of spilled coffee, plates of spaghetti, or margarine pats. Whenever I saw her, I wanted to change directions and run, but hypnotized by the anticipation of disaster, I would watch as she accosted whoever drew her wrath at the moment. When she began to swear at some unfortunate sailor or soldier, I would shrink, turn my eyes to the pavement, and try to hurry by, but the sound of her voice transfixed me, snake-like. With the swear lady, profanity was an art form. She always seemed moved to the heights of sublimity whenever she spotted a sailor. Upon seeing a blue uniform and a white hat, or in times of need, a soldier, she would loose a string of withering oaths, not elegant but certainly grand. Stream of consciousness be damned. A stream of words was her palette. With a few well-chosen adjectives, she could pulverize the Rock of Gibraltar. The hapless targets of her venom were, of course, at first nonplussed. Then, noting her size, the sailors would start to laugh. A big mistake, since she then redoubled her efforts until a crowd gathered in disbelief. Oddly, no one ever returned her fire, either to remonstrate or encourage, lest she turn and rend them too. Once she picked on me, although I had long been out of uniform. I felt I ought to drop into a nearby phone booth where I could at least shut a door between her and me. Coward that I am, I turned and walked away as fast as I could, on the verge of outright panic. I have no idea whatever happened to her. Just as gradually as I had become aware of her, she melted away. Perhaps she got sick and died or got trucked off to an asylum, but wherever she went or whatever happened, I want to thank her for enlarging my vocabulary. Since hearing her, my speech may not be more picturesque, but listening to her epithets has enriched my appreciation of the English language. Mark Twain once told his wife, "You know the words, my dear, but you don't know the tune." The swear lady's tune was pure Mozart. Lots of dull afternoons extend the length of days in most cities, but in San Francisco, Powell Street was occasionally given an adrenaline boost by the arm swinger. Athletically, he could have stood alongside Magic Johnson, Willie Mays, or Evander Holyfield, or any other world-class calisthenics. About medium height, fairly broad shoulders, emphasized by the ridiculous padding in his coat, the arm swinger was lank, graying almost bald-pated terror. Since he never wore a hat and spent most of his time wandering the streets, his bald head was heavily tanned. While he spent his walking hours marching up and down, I never found out where he actually lived or where he went at night, perhaps to some homeless shelter. Several times a day, I would run into him as he charged up and down the sidewalks with long, swinging steps, grinding his teeth and grunting. But it was his long, looping arms that gave pedestrians the shudders. A dervish of his sort scared everyone for blocks around. He would advance on some unfortunate, barging forward as he swung his arm up and across the top of the head of his unsuspecting victim. By instinct, the guy would duck. The arm swinger would grunt, wail, and pass on to the next target. Since he could swing high and wide with either arm, he didn't actually hit anyone, but the startled look on the faces of those he approached was something to see. Stark terror. He never stopped or listened to the curses hurled after him as he marched along the sidewalks. He appeared to feel his assaults were more a matter of style than substance. It was a wonder how long it would be before he actually connected with some unfortunate who should have dodged instead of ducked. I was surprised one day when he went into his act. A young man ducked under the swinging arm and came up with a right to the jaw that sounded like a bullet hitting concrete. The arm swinger went down like a sack of mush, flattened on the street. The man who had hit him edged away into the crowd as the arm swinger found consciousness again and got up before much of a crowd could gather. He bellowed like a truck horn. massaged his chin area, and sallied on into the crowds. The next day I saw him yet again. He was still doing his thing, swinging away. But somehow, perhaps subjectively on my part, the swings didn't have the same zest. Your guess is as good as mine as to what happened to him. Perhaps nothing. At least he isn't around anymore. Hello there, everyone in the chat. Nice to see you. Suzanne Lenglen, at least she thought she was Suzanne Lenglen, was another character who helped brighten many a sunny day. Who helped brighten many a day. Currently, not too many people remember who Suzanne Lenglen was, but in the 1920s, she, along with Big Bill Tilden, ruled the world of tennis. The Powell Street Suzanne, however, was strictly a creation of her own mind. She wore a white midi and skirt with white tennis shoes, naturally, Keds, no doubt, plus the trademark white headband. Occasionally, she would pause in her stride, take a swing at an imaginary ball, watch its invisible flight, and then proceed up the street. She was well known in the bookshops of the city, since when she came in, she would always say, "Any books on tennis?" And then, when answered in the negative, she would sigh and retrace her steps to the sidewalk. Naturally, a street with a traffic flow such as you find on Powell would be expected to produce a fair share of oddballs, even the man who wandered up and down with a small bird perched on his outstretched forefinger, perhaps one of the first conservationists. While I've been in almost all parts of San Francisco and talked with endless numbers of its residents and have visited most of the large cities in the United States and Canada, I don't think I have ever encountered the number of deviants I have encountered in San Francisco. But then San Francisco is the last big destination in the U.S. before you find yourself in the Pacific Ocean. Beyond San Francisco, you run out of dry land. I have heard the theory advanced that the disturbed of the earth come to San Francisco because it is a tolerant city and they expect to find some peace there. Then they discover to their dismay that a place change doesn't produce a corresponding metamorphosis in their psyches. For many, the next stop is the Golden Gate Bridge. Native San Franciscans say the reason the jumpers all leap from the east side of the bridge is because that side faces the city's skyline, and they want to see their fantasies disappear as they go down. Actually, the main reason is that there is no foot traffic allowed on the ocean side. Today, Powell Street is a mess, a rowdy collection of bargain basement type stores where the only thing special about the price is that you can buy the stuff almost anywhere in the city for less money than the cut rate merchants post in large red letters in their Powell Street show windows. The collection of pedestrians range from spaced out drug users to aging hippies who fell through the cracks during the era of flower children and who once congregated along Haight Street during the late 60s and early 70s. There are also those who hurry through this strange scene, hoping against hope they won't be panhandled or verbally abused in some aggressive manner. Once in a great while, a knife fight erupts and the legitimate citizens scatter like confetti driven by an exploding firecracker. Purse snatchers, pickpockets, and short change artists abound, deviants getting their jollies. So far, however, Powell Street hasn't descended to the level of Kearny Street back in the mid-1800s. At that time, gunfire signaled murders at a rate of 5 a day. But then, there is lots of the future left. Gone is the era of tolerant and benign neglect that enabled citizens to walk, if not in perfect peace, at least without fear. I was talking to a policeman one day and asked him what the city was doing to straighten matters out, and he said, "Well, we try. We arrest a few, prevent a few nuts from harassing pedestrians, but it's a lot like trying to sweep sand against the sea. Between Aaron Slick from Punkin Crick lawyers in the DA's office and the kind of judges on the municipal bench, most of these cats are back on the street again the same day. One of these days, I wouldn't be surprised to see another vigilance committee." He was, of course, referring to the gold rush period when the vigilantes hanged John Jenkins from a gable of the old customs house in Portsmouth Square. This had a momentary effect on the crime rate and slowed murders some, but it wasn't until 3 years later in 1854 when a second vigilance committee was formed and Charles Cora and James P. Casey were hanged on Sacramento Street. The Second Vigilance Committee numbered 9,000 men. During this reign, there were 4 hangings and 30 undesirables were banished from the state. Cruel and unusual punishment. But the law suddenly had new meaning. And that is where I will stop for the day. I will return tomorrow with more readings from my grandfather's book, Nowhere Except San Francisco, Memoirs of a Resident Tourist. We're getting towards the end of the book. I bet we will finish this book this week for sure. And then I will move on to one of his other 2 books. We've got, I don't know which one was the first one, but he's got a book called Now What, which is, it is his sense of humor, and I can't I can't wait to read more. I look forward, and I hope that you join me again. I will try to come back tomorrow around 3 or 3:30 p.m. to be able to read more San Francisco stories. Tell your friends if your friends like history and old San Francisco kind of stories. I hope you all are having a wonderful day. I hope that you have something to look forward to. I'm going to make this my looking forward to something every day moment. And I guess that's it. Who else is there in the chat? I can't see it. Oh, yes. Thank you, Decremet and Kemal and Kurt Larson and Shal with a bunch of numbers. I am so glad to make your gloomy day brighter. I do hope that we can do the same tomorrow. Thank you again for joining me, and I will be back. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Bye.